Hello, my name is Hans Struppert and I have repaired Macs and upgraded Macs for quite a number of years. Today I would like to show you an old friend, a friend well in its teens, a friend that has been around since 2004, namely an iMac G5 with a screen resolution of 1680 by 1050. This friend is no longer slow. This friend is no longer limited to the operating system 10.5.8. This friend now is very fast and it runs macOS version 11.1, also known as Big Sur. This upgraded Mac no longer has a PowerPC G5 processor, but now it has an Apple M1 processor. That M1 processor comes from a MacMini, along with its relatively small logic board. And as one would expect, we are getting M1 performance from this iMac. This probably means that this particular iMac, upgraded with the M1 board, is the fastest iMac south of Cupertino. Well, here we go. It gives us a Cinebench results of about 6850 for multiprocessor, the multiprocessor benchmark or multi-core benchmark. The Blackmagic disk speed test gives us numbers of about 3200 megabytes per second for write and 2850 megabytes per second for read. And in this particular case, my Macintosh is connected to my Wi-Fi. I'm using a USB mouse and I'm using a wired, old, trusty USB keyboard. But there's more. There's also an internal 2 terabyte hard disk drive, namely an SSD-based hard disk drive with a speed of more than 500 megabytes per second. All in all, a very usable workstation with a resolution, as mentioned before, of 1680 by 1050. On the back we have, at this point of time, one external USB-A port, one external USB-C port, an Ethernet connector, and the on-off switch to turn the machine on or off. Now, I did not purchase this particular device, but I made it. And I made this upgrade by using an existing G5 iMac and basically replacing the processor. This upgrade today is a proof of concepts. It's in a very rudimentary stage, but I wanted to show it to you now. When you open the case of the iMac G5, that is what you see. Specifically, on the bottom half, we have the G5 logic board. On the left-hand side of the logic board, we see about 10 vertically arranged ports, including USB ports, including FireWire ports, and an Ethernet port. In the middle, slightly to the right of the middle, we see the large G5 heat sink. To the right of that, there are 2 DRAM sockets. In the top right-hand corner, the black device is the SATA hard disk drive. In the top left-hand corner, we see the DVD-ROM or CD read-write device. And above the logic board, in the middle, there are 2 cooling fans. On the very bottom, we have 2 speakers in the corners and a silver power supply in the middle. Notice also in the 8 o'clock position, there is an area which accepts a Wi-Fi card, and we can see the curled antenna cable ready to be plugged into the Wi-Fi card. Now, in order to insert the M1 processor, we first need to strip all existing components, and that's how the iMac Chief chassis looks like after everything has been removed except for the power supply, the LCD panel, and the speakers. And specifically, we see here on the right hand side four connectors, two pairs of two connectors for the LCD backlight. On the bottom left-hand side there are several connectors, including the connectors to the left and the right speaker. On the top left we see the curled Wi-Fi antenna, which is not used in this particular modification, in this particular upgrade, at least not yet used. In the top middle there is the tail of a new LVDS data cable for the LCD display. This cable already has been inserted into the LCD panel and goes to the LCD driver board that we will see in a minute. Now let's look at the back of a Mac Mini. You probably already have seen that it has two USB-A ports. It has an HDMI port which we will be using to drive the display. It has two USB-C ports, at least one of which is routed to the outside of the iMac M1. It has an Ethernet port which is also forwarded. It has the mains power supply input, and on the very left hand side an on-off switch, and finally just above my head the headphone jack. Now what we need to do, we need to open the iMac, we need to open the Mac Mini and retrieve the components. Namely, the components that we need to retrieve is the power supply that we can see here on the right. We need to also take out the fan with its 6-pin connector, although we are not using the fan in this particular upgrade. And we need to take out the logic board assembly, which you see below the fan. Everything should be completely reversible, thus we should be able to reassemble the components at a later time to obtain a fully functional M1 Mac Mini. These are the components that we have been harvested. We see here again the logic board assembly on the right and the power supply. This is how the converted Mac looks inside in this proof of concept conversion. Specifically, we see the Mac Mini logic board on the top right hand. Below the logic board, vertically mounted, is the M1 power supply with its rounded corners. To the right, mounted diagonally, we see the LCD fluorescent backlight driver board. This driver board connects directly to the four backlight connectors that we saw earlier. It is controlled by the green board on the top left hand corner, the HDMI to LVDS converter. So this green board on the top left hand corner actually connects the LCD panel through its control logic to the HDMI connector. In addition, we see in the middle of the chassis a 2 TB SATA SSD connected via cable to a USB-A connector on the back of the Mac Mini. We see one USB-A connection and one USB-C connection going from the M1 logic board to the left side of the chassis to be eventually come out of the back of the iMac M1. Looking closely, we also can spot the power switch, the on-off switch cable that runs from the M1 logic board to the left side of the chassis. We also can find a speaker cable going from the HDMI to LVDS converter board to the bottom left hand corner where the speaker connection is. And finally, we see a power supply cable from the original iMac G5 power supply to the barrel connector on the left of the HDMI to LVDS converter board. Let's look at these items a little bit closer. Let's start with the HDMI to LVDS converter board. This board receives the HDMI signal from the M1 logic board via the blue black connector on the bottom, and it converts this signal to the LVDS connector on the top of the board, which is configured as a 2-row 30-pin connector. The DVI connector, which is white, and the VGA connector, which is blue, on the bottom of the board are not used. The board receives its 12-volt power from the original iMac G5 power supply via the barrel connector on the left. The 6-pin connector on the left controls the high voltage backlight board. The 4-pin header on the right, which does not have a cable connected in this particular picture, goes to the internal speaker. The 8-pin cable in the 10-pin connector on the top left goes to a control board for an on-screen menu, which among other things allows the screen to be dimmed or brightened. Not easily visible in this particular conversion board is the custom 3D bracket, which mounts the HDMI to LVDS converter board. It is screwed into the existing studs of the iMac G5 and then mounts the board via its normal mounting holes. Now let's take a closer look at the power supply for the M1. In order to reach the M1 logic board, the 20-pin power cable needed to be extended. In this particular proof of concept, I cut the existing cable and spliced an additional 6-inch or 200 millimeters to extend the cable length. In the future, there might be a simple 20-pin extension using the connectors manufactured by Hiroshi. The power supply is mounted via a 3D bracket directly to the iMac G5 chassis. The mains side of the power supply is, via a standard power connector, attached to the inside of the original iMac G5 power supply. The diagonally mounted high voltage board could be shortened and redesigned in the future to allow non-slanted mounting. This picture shows one single USB cable going to the left. It is possible via a 90-degree USB-C connector to actually use both USB-C ports. Also note the blue Ethernet cable extending from the back of the MacMini M1 to the left of the iMac G5 chassis. Now let's take a closer look at the mounting of the logic board. The logic board again is mounted via a 3D bracket in the existing hardware of the iMac G5. You see specifically a 2-pin white connector in the middle of the picture to the left of the M1 logic board. This particular logic board comes from the on-off switch of the iMac G5 chassis. Here we have a close-up of this particular connector. It mounts to a 20 millimeter by 20 millimeter perf board, which then extends via 2 tiny cables to a flex cable. And this particular flex cable was previously connected to the on-off switch in the back of the MacMini M1. In this conversion, now it will connect to the on-off switch in the back of the G5 chassis. And the other side of this flex cable connects to the M1 logic board and performs the on-off function. We see an 8-pin connector. That 8-pin connector attaches to the 6-pin cable that we saw, but only 2 wires out of those 6 pins are active, namely they perform the on-off function. Here we see the extension cables that come from the back of the M1 logic board. Specifically, we see the blue Ethernet cable. We see the white connector with the 2 pins that are soldered onto the golden contacts on the back of the iMac G5 power switch. And at 45 degree, we see a USB-A extension cable. Below that, we see a USB-C extension cable. So once the hood is closed and the iMac is powered up, we have a modern Mac in a retro chassis. It's fun to use. Okay. So I've done this one time only. It's a proof of concept and it works well for me. But what if you want to do it too? What can be done to simplify or streamline the conversion? Well, here we have the iMac G5 logic board. You see the 10 connectors lined up on the left hand side, starting from the microphone connector, headphone connector, and then we have the external video connector, followed by 3 USB and 2 Firewire connectors. Then we have the now unused modem connector and Ethernet receptacle, and finally the 2-pin spring-loaded on-off connector. In order to reduce the amount of wiring inside the chassis, to make it more reliable, and to fill most ports on the back, a printed circuit board needs to be designed and manufactured. This PCB would mount to the iMac G5 chassis just like the original logic board, and all the connectors would peek through the holes in the back of the chassis. Thus no connector needs to be unplugged and reconnected when removing and reattaching the back chassis. It also would be possible to actually add an SD card reader, which possibly could be accessible via the existing CD-ROM slot. Now, in addition to this, there should be a flex cable for an on-off switch to simplify the connection of the iMac M1 logic board to the back connector. We could reduce the size of the high voltage AV board for the backlight of the LCD panel, so it can be mounted in a non-slanted way. We can simplify the HDMI to LVDS board because we don't need the DVI connector, nor do we need the VGA connector. But maybe you have some additional suggestions and simplifications. Should that be attempted for other iMac computers, for example for the iMac 24-inch or the iMac 27-inch? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the meantime, I'll be using my fast iMac M1, and happy Mac computing to you as well. Bye bye.